Imagine you are standing on the deck of an American warship somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. The year is 1945. The war is almost over, you know it. Every sailor around you knows it. Japan is losing. Its cities are being bombed to rubble. Its navy is shattered. Its army is retreating on every front. Victory feels close enough to touch. And then someone shouts, a single word that turns your blood to ice. A word that has become the most terrifying sound in the entire United States Navy. That word is kamikazes. And in that moment, every man on that deck knows that the most dangerous part of this war might not be behind them. It might be screaming toward them right now at 300 miles per hour, carrying a pilot who woke up that morning knowing he would never see tomorrow, and who has decided that taking your ship down with him is the greatest honor he can imagine. This is not the story of Pearl Harbor. This is something far darker, far stranger, and in many ways far more frightening. This is the story of how a desperate, dying empire looked into the abyss of its own destruction and invented a weapon so psychologically devastating, so tactically innovative, and so brutally effective that it nearly broke the most powerful naval force in human history. This is the story of the kamikazes. And by the time this is over, you will understand why American admirals, battle-hardened men who had survived everything the Pacific War had thrown at them, would later say in private that 1945 scared them far more than December 7, 1941 ever did. To understand why the kamikaze program was born, you have to understand the position Japan found itself in by late 1944. This was a nation that had gambled everything on a lightning war. The plan had always been audacious, some would say insane, but it had a brutal internal logic. Strike the Americans hard at Pearl Harbor, seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, build an impenetrable defensive perimeter, and then when the Americans tried to fight their way back, bleed them so badly, exact such a horrifying price in blood and treasure, that they would eventually choose a negotiated peace over the nightmare of an endless war. It was a strategy built on the assumption that America lacked the will to fight a long, brutal, grinding conflict. That assumption turned out to be catastrophically wrong. By the summer of 1944, the American war machine was operating at a scale that the Japanese high command had never imagined possible. New aircraft carriers were being launched at a rate that seemed almost supernatural. New planes, faster, better armed, and flown by more experienced pilots, were filling the skies over the Pacific. The island-hopping campaign, that brilliant strategy devised by American commanders to bypass Japanese strongholds and strike directly at the heart of the empire's defensive perimeter, was working with terrifying efficiency. Saipan fell in July 1944. The Philippines were under direct threat. And in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese carrier aviation arm, once the most feared force in the Pacific, was essentially destroyed. American pilots shot down so many Japanese planes in a single afternoon that they nicknamed the engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was a massacre, and it signaled something that Japanese commanders could no longer deny. In a conventional war fought with conventional weapons and conventional tactics, Japan had already lost. The only question was how long the dying would take. It was against this backdrop of creeping, inevitable disaster that a Japanese naval officer named Vice Admiral Onishi arrived in the Philippines in October 1944. Onishi was not a fool. He was not a fanatic in the crude sense of the word. He was a calculating, clear-eyed military professional who had looked at the mathematics of the situation and arrived at a conclusion that was as logical as it was horrifying. Japan's conventional air forces could no longer effectively damage the American fleet. Pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. The ones who survived were increasingly inexperienced, rushed through training programs that no longer had the time or resources to produce the kind of aviators who had struck Pearl Harbor. Against the overwhelming air superiority of the American carrier groups, conventional attack runs were producing minimal results at maximum cost. But Onishi had been thinking about a different kind of attack, an attack that did not require a pilot to survive. An attack where the aircraft itself was the weapon, guided by human hands with perfect precision directly into the target. He called it the Special Attack Corps. History would call it something else entirely, a word borrowed from Japanese mythology, kamikaze, divine wind. The name itself was chosen deliberately, and understanding why requires a brief journey back 7 centuries to one of the most dramatic moments in Japanese history. In 1274 and again in 1281, the Mongol Empire, the greatest land power the world had ever seen, attempted to invade Japan. Kublai Khan assembled massive fleets, hundreds of ships carrying tens of thousands of warriors, and sent them across the sea toward the Japanese islands. Both times at the moment of greatest peril, when Japanese defenders were being overwhelmed on the beaches, a typhoon of almost supernatural ferocity struck the Mongol fleets and destroyed them. The Japanese saw in these storms the hand of the divine, a wind sent by the gods to protect their sacred islands. They called it Kamikaze, divine wind. And now in 1944, Onishi and the men around him were deliberately invoking that mythology, connecting their suicide pilots to that ancient, mystical moment of divine intervention. They were telling young Japanese men that they were not merely soldiers accepting death. They were the divine wind itself, summoned once again to protect Japan in its hour of maximum peril. The psychological power of that framing should not be underestimated. It transformed what might have seemed like a brutal waste of human life into something that felt, to many young Japanese men raised in a culture that had elevated sacrifice and honor above survival, like the highest possible calling. The first organized kamikaze attacks came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, and the results stunned everyone, including the men who had planned them. On October 25th, a small group of Zero fighters, each carrying a single bomb, flew toward a group of American escort carriers off the coast of Samar. These were not the big fleet carriers, the massive armored vessels that formed the core of American naval power. They were smaller, lightly armed ships, and they were in serious trouble that day, caught in a desperate battle against a much more powerful Japanese surface force. But it was the kamikazes that would leave the deepest mark. One of the Zero pilots aimed his plane directly at the escort carrier sent low. He hit it square on the flight deck. The bomb he carried penetrated to the hangar deck below before exploding. And then something happened that would become sickeningly familiar over the next 10 months. Secondary explosions tore through the ship as aviation fuel and armed aircraft in the hangar deck ignited. The St. Lo sank in less than 30 minutes, becoming the first ship in history to be sunk by a deliberate suicide air attack. On that same day, other kamikazes hit the carriers Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, and White Plains, along with several destroyers. The shock that ran through the American fleet was immediate and profound. This was something new, something the training manuals hadn't covered, something that the massive, elaborate defensive systems of the American fleet had not been designed to stop. To understand why the kamikazes were so terrifying, you have to understand what they were actually doing, mechanically and tactically, and why it was so much harder to stop than a conventional air attack. A conventional attack run by a bomber or torpedo plane was inherently self-limiting. The pilot had to release his bomb or torpedo at some distance from the target. He needed to survive the attack in order to pull out of his dive or his run. He was being asked to do something precise and technically demanding under fire, and his instinct for self-preservation was working against him every step of the way. The anti-aircraft gunners on American ships knew the geometry of these attacks. They knew the angles of approach, the altitudes, the speeds. They had developed sophisticated fire control systems that could predict where a conventionally attacking plane would be. But the kamikaze changed everything. A pilot who has decided to die does not pull out. He does not release early to stay above the flak. He does not jink and dodge in ways that might compromise his aim. He can fly straight and steady and low, absorbing incredible punishment. Because he does not care if he lives. The ship's gunners might hit him. They might blow off his wing or shatter his engine. But if any part of him kept flying, if the wreckage of his plane, burning and disintegrating, still had enough forward momentum, it could still hit the ship. And even a hit from a plane that had been essentially destroyed in the air could cause devastating damage, because the kamikaze was carrying not just a bomb but a full load of aviation fuel. and burning aviation fuel pouring across a ship's deck and into its interior spaces was one of the most deadly things a warship could face. The Americans were not naive about this. They understood the problem and they threw enormous resources at solving it. Combat air patrols, the fighter planes that flew above the fleet to intercept incoming attackers, were expanded massively. The radar picket line, a network of destroyers deployed far ahead of the main fleet specifically to provide early warning and serve as the first line of defense against kamikaze attack, was developed and refined. These radar picket ships were among the most dangerous assignments in the Pacific War because they were positioned precisely where kamikazes would first encounter opposition, and they became the primary targets of attack after attack. The gun crews on American ships trained to a level of intensity that approached desperation, practicing until the physical mechanics of loading, aiming, and firing became completely automatic, because they knew that in a kamikaze attack, there might be only seconds between first sighting and impact. New fusing systems for anti-aircraft shells were developed, including the remarkable proximity fuse, a tiny radio transmitter and receiver built into the shell itself that detonated it when it passed close to an aircraft, vastly increasing the lethality of anti-aircraft fire. And yet, despite all of this, despite every technological innovation and tactical adaptation the Americans could devise, the kamikazes kept getting through. Not always, not even most of the time, but often enough to keep the entire fleet in a state of sustained terror that would last for 10 months. The numbers tell a story that is both impressive and sobering, depending on which side of the equation you are on. During the Okinawa campaign alone, which lasted from April to June of 1945, and which represented the largest and most sustained kamikaze offensive of the war, approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties were flown against the American fleet. Of these, roughly 14% succeeded in hitting their targets. That might sound like a low percentage, but consider what that 14% translated to in actual damage. 36 American ships were sunk during the Okinawa campaign. Over 350 more were damaged, many of them severely. Almost 5,000 American sailors were killed by kamikaze attacks at Okinawa alone, making it the single costliest naval campaign in terms of casualties in the entire Pacific War. The destroyer USS Laffey, which became known as the ship that would not die, was hit by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs in a single attack on April 16, 1945. By any rational measure, it should have sunk. It didn't. But the men aboard it paid a terrible price, and the fact that the Laffey story is remembered primarily as a tale of American resilience and survival should not obscure what the kamikazes actually accomplished that day, or on hundreds of other days along the radar picket line. The psychological dimension of the kamikaze campaign was in some ways even more significant than the physical damage. War is, at its core, a contest of will as much as a contest of material. And the kamikazes were attacking American morale in ways that conventional weapons simply could not. A torpedo attack or a bombing run ends. The plane either hits or it misses, and then it's gone. The crew can catch their breath, treat their wounded, assess their damage, and prepare for the next attack. But living under the constant threat of kamikaze attack was something qualitatively different. There was no moment of resolution. There was no "the attack is over." Every aircraft spotted on radar, every dot that appeared on the horizon, every contact called out by a lookout had to be treated as a potential suicide plane. The tension was continuous, relentless, grinding. Sleep-deprived sailors stood at their battle stations for hours, days, knowing that at any moment a young Japanese man might come screaming out of the sun, and there would be almost nothing they could do except try to shoot him down before he hit them. The psychological toll on American sailors was severe and largely hidden at the time, suppressed by military censorship and the demands of the war effort. After the war, the men who served on the radar picket line, those destroyers and destroyer escorts that formed the first wall between the kamikaze and the main fleet, would speak in hushed tones about what they had experienced. Some never spoke about it at all. This is where the story becomes genuinely complex because to understand the kamikazes fully, you cannot simply look at them from the American perspective. You have to try to understand them from the inside. Who were these men? What drove them to choose this? And is the word choose even the right one to use? The answer is complicated and deeply uncomfortable, and it does not fit neatly into any simple narrative. The pilots who flew the first kamikaze missions in October 1944 were to a significant degree volunteers, men who genuinely believed in what they were doing, men who had been raised in a culture that placed the highest possible value on sacrifice for emperor and nation, who saw in the kamikaze mission a chance to give their deaths meaning and purpose. Many of them were young, in their late teens and early 20s, students whose university careers had been interrupted by the war. They wrote letters home that were eloquent and heartbreaking, letters that spoke of love for their families, of appreciation for the beauty of cherry blossoms, of hope that their deaths would contribute to Japan's survival. These were not empty-eyed fanatics. They were human beings caught in a machinery of war and ideology that had offered them a particular kind of meaning in the face of their own mortality, and many of them had genuinely accepted that meaning. But the picture becomes more complicated as the war went on, and the kamikaze program expanded far beyond that original core of committed volunteers. By 1945, Japan was running out of experienced pilots. The men who formed the later waves of kamikaze attackers were often very young, very inexperienced, and the degree to which their volunteering was genuinely free is deeply questionable. Unit commanders applied enormous social pressure. To refuse was to mark yourself as a coward, a traitor, someone who did not care about Japan's survival. In a culture that valued group harmony and the opinion of one's peers above almost everything else, this pressure was nearly irresistible. Some men genuinely wanted to fly these missions. Some accepted them with a kind of resigned fatalism, and some were terrified and hid it, and climbed into their planes and flew to their deaths carrying fear that they had nowhere to express. The historian Emiko Onuki-Tierney, who spent years studying the diaries and letters of kamikaze pilots, found a picture far more nuanced and far more tragic than the simple story of fanatic warriors choosing death with joy. Many of these young men had private doubts that they could not express publicly. Many were intellectuals who had read Western philosophy and harbored complicated feelings about the ideology they were being asked to die for. They were trapped. And the trap that held them was built not from physical bars, but from culture and duty and love of family and fear of shame, and the genuine, heartfelt belief that their deaths might matter. The training, or rather the often shocking lack of it, that went into producing kamikaze pilots in 1945 is one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire program. In the early weeks of the campaign, the men flying suicide missions were, by and large, capable aviators. Pilots with real experience, men who understood their aircraft, who could navigate, who could find their targets. But Japan was burning through its aviators at a catastrophic rate, and the replacement pipeline had collapsed. By 1945, some kamikaze pilots were being sent on their final missions after receiving only a handful of hours of flight training, just enough to get the plane into the air and pointed roughly in the right direction. Not enough to land it, because landing it was never the point. The brutality of this calculation is staggering. Young men were being given just enough skill to die. The Japanese high command was making a decision that they were worth more as guided missiles than as trained aviators. And the young men themselves, for the most part, accepted this. They had been told it was an honor. Many of them believed it. Some of them surely died wondering. By the time of the Okinawa campaign, the kamikaze program had evolved into something of remarkable tactical sophistication. The Japanese were no longer simply sending individual planes. They were orchestrating mass attacks known as kikusui, meaning floating chrysanthemums, that combined dozens or even hundreds of kamikazes with conventional bombers, torpedo planes, and fighter escorts, designed to overwhelm American defenses through sheer volume. The largest of these kikusui attacks involved hundreds of aircraft, a wave of destruction intended to swamp the radar picket line, exhaust the combat air patrol fighters, and allow the kamikazes to get through to the carriers and battleships of the main fleet. The planning that went into these attacks was sophisticated, even brilliant in a terrible way. They were timed to exploit gaps in American radar coverage. They used cloud cover and the low angles of the rising and setting sun to approach from directions that made interception more difficult. Pilots were instructed to fly nap of the Earth, skimming the surface of the ocean at wave-top height where radar had trouble tracking them. And they were taught to aim specifically for the most vulnerable parts of a ship: the flight deck of a carrier where a hit could destroy parked aircraft and detonate aviation fuel, the bridge where a hit could kill the ship's command structure, or the waterline where an explosion might rupture the hull. This was not chaos. This was a systematic, carefully designed campaign to destroy American naval power one ship at a time. The specific experience of the radar picket ships deserves extended attention because it is one of the most harrowing and least known stories of the Second World War. When American planners designed the picket line for the Okinawa operation, they understood that the destroyers and destroyer escorts stationed on the outer ring of the fleet's protection would be in extreme danger. What they perhaps did not fully anticipate was the degree to which the Japanese would make those ships the primary focus of their attention. The logic was clear in retrospect. Take out the radar pickets and you blind the fleet. Destroy the forward air controllers and the combat air patrols lose their guidance. And so the picket stations became killing grounds. Station 1 and Station 2, the two outer positions on the picket line, became so notorious for the intensity of the attacks they attracted that they were known among American sailors simply by the grim nickname, the Slaughterhouse. Destroyers assigned to those stations knew, statistically, that their chances of coming through the Okinawa campaign undamaged were vanishingly small. The USS Hadley and the USS Evans, two destroyers on picket duty in May 1945, together shot down an almost unbelievable total of roughly 65 aircraft in a single action while sustaining severe damage. They survived. Not everyone did. The USS Manert El Abil became the first ship sunk by an Ohka, one of the specialized rocket-powered kamikaze glider bombs that the Japanese had developed specifically to be faster and harder to intercept than a conventional aircraft. The Ohka, which the Americans nicknamed Baka, meaning fool, was essentially a human-guided cruise missile. A young man sealed inside a streamlined wooden body packed with explosives, released from a carrier aircraft, guiding himself toward the target at speeds that nothing in the American arsenal could reliably intercept. The Ohka represented a technological evolution in the kamikaze concept that speaks to how seriously the Japanese high command was taking this weapon. They were not simply improvising. They were investing engineering resources, design talent, and manufacturing capacity into purpose-built suicide weapons. Alongside the Ohka, they developed the Shinyo explosive motorboats that would ram American ships at night, and the Kite, which were essentially human-guided torpedoes, modified from the enormous Type 93 Long Lance torpedo with a cockpit built into them, allowing a pilot to steer directly toward a target. They were working on submarine-launched suicide weapons. They were developing the Ohka 43, an improved version that could be launched from shore-based catapults and could fly further and faster than the original. The entire weapons development program of late-war Japan was bending itself toward the production of suicide weapons in greater numbers and with greater effectiveness. And behind all of this was a strategic concept that the Japanese called Ketsugo, the plan for the defense of the home islands against the American invasion that everyone knew was coming. In the context of Ketsugo, the kamikazes were not merely a tactical weapon. They were the centerpiece of a strategy designed to inflict such catastrophic losses on the American invasion fleet that the cost of invading Japan would become politically unacceptable in Washington. The American commanders who had to deal with this threat were among the most experienced and capable naval officers in history. Men like Admiral Raymond Spruance and Admiral William Halsey had been fighting this war since the beginning. They had seen almost everything. But the Kamikaze campaign pushed them to their limits in ways that conventional warfare had not. The sheer continuous nature of the threat was exhausting. At Okinawa, the fleet was under near constant attack for 82 days. Sailors rotated through watches at battle stations, ate at battle stations, slept at battle stations, because there was no safe moment, no guaranteed window of peace. The stress accumulated. Officers who had commanded ships through the most intense conventional naval battles of the war broke down under the sustained psychological pressure of Okinawa. Admiral Mitcher, one of the most gifted carrier commanders in American naval history, emerged from the Okinawa campaign visibly aged, a man who had been physically ground down by months of unrelenting kamikaze attack. He would be dead within 2 years, and those who knew him best believed that Okinawa had broken something in him that never fully healed. The strategic implications of all this were not lost on the planners in Washington who were working on Operation Downfall, the plan for the invasion of Japan. They had the casualty reports from Okinawa. They had the intelligence assessments of Japanese kamikaze strength, and what they were reading terrified them. Japanese planners had assembled approximately 10,000 aircraft for the defense of the home islands, a significant portion of them designated for kamikaze missions. Some estimates put the number even higher, when you included the motorboats, submarines, and other suicide weapons systems that were being prepared. American planners estimated that the invasion of Kyushu alone, the first phase of Operation Downfall scheduled for November 1945, could result in the destruction or serious damage of hundreds of American ships, potentially threatening the entire logistical infrastructure of the invasion. One estimate, prepared for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, suggested that American casualties in the invasion of Japan could reach into the hundreds of thousands, with some models producing numbers that climbed toward 1 million. The kamikazes were a central, dominant variable in these calculations. It was not an abstraction. The men running these numbers had watched what happened at Okinawa, had tallied the ships sunk and damaged, had counted the dead, and were extrapolating from that experience to the far larger scale of an invasion of the home islands. This context is essential for understanding one of the most debated decisions in all of military history, a decision that still generates passionate argument 8 decades later. In August 1945, President Harry Truman authorized the use of atomic bombs against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The debate about whether that decision was justified, whether it was necessary, whether the bombs should have been used against military targets or not used at all, is a genuine and important one that historians and ethicists have been having for 80 years and will continue to have. But one thing that cannot be honestly disputed is that the kamikaze threat was a significant, perhaps decisive, factor in the thinking of the men who made that decision. They had watched the Pacific War's casualty curve. They had seen what Okinawa cost. They had read the intelligence reports about Japanese preparations for the defense of the home islands. And they knew that an invasion would mean sending hundreds of thousands of young Americans into a zone saturated with every suicide weapon Japan could devise. The atomic bomb, terrible as it was, looked to men like Truman and Secretary of War Henry Stimson like the only alternative to that prospect. Whatever you think of that reasoning, whatever moral weight you assign to it, the kamikazes were woven into it at every level. Japan's surrender in August 1945 meant that Operation Downfall never happened. The kamikazes that had been held back for the invasion defense never flew their final missions. 10,000 aircraft sat waiting in revetments and hidden hangars across the Japanese islands, and their pilots, some of them teenagers who had been training for months for a battle that would never come, suddenly found themselves in a world where they were expected to go on living. This transition was, for many of them, profoundly disorienting. They had organized their entire inner lives around their imminent deaths. They had said their goodbyes. They had written their final letters. They had made whatever peace they could make with their own mortality. And then suddenly they were alive. Japan had surrendered. The emperor had spoken in that extraordinary radio broadcast of August 15th in a voice that most Japanese people had never heard before, acknowledging that the war had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. And the men who had been prepared to die for him found themselves in a world that had changed entirely and had to figure out how to live in it. The post-war reckoning with the kamikaze program is a study in the complexity of historical memory. In Japan, for decades after the war, the kamikaze pilots were a deeply contested subject. The official narrative of the post-war Japanese state, shaped by the requirements of occupation, democratization, and the enormous effort to build a new national identity on the ruins of militarism, had difficulty accommodating them. They were simultaneously victims of a militarist system that had sacrificed them, heroes to those who still believed in the values they had died for, and an uncomfortable reminder of where the ideology of emperor worship and national sacrifice could lead. The Kairin Peace Museum in Kagoshima Prefecture, built near one of the major kamikaze bases, became one of the most visited war memorials in Japan. It houses thousands of letters and personal effects left behind by kamikaze pilots, and it draws an extraordinary range of visitors, from elderly veterans to school groups to tourists from around the world. Standing in that museum, reading the letters of young men who died 70 or 80 years ago, is one of those experiences that bypasses intellectual analysis entirely and hits you somewhere much more fundamental. These were people. Whatever the ideology that killed them, whatever the political machinery that sent them to their deaths, they were people with families and dreams and fears, and they deserve to be remembered as such. The American memory of the kamikazes is its own kind of complicated. For decades after the war, the official history emphasized American resilience and the ultimate ineffectiveness of the kamikaze program. The ships survived, the fleet held, the invasion was never needed. These things are true. But they tend to obscure what the experience actually cost, what it actually felt like. The veterans who served on the radar picket line, the sailors who watched their shipmates burn, the officers who kept their fear locked inside during 82 days of sustained attack at Okinawa, these men carried their experiences largely in silence for decades. The greatest generation did not talk about what it had seen. That was not the culture. And so a great deal of what the kamikaze campaign actually meant in human terms, the fear, the grief, the sustained trauma of months under suicidal attack, was never fully processed publicly. It was only in the later decades of the 20th century, as veterans began to age and feel the urgency of telling their stories before they were gone forever, that the full human dimension of the kamikaze experience on the American side began to emerge in memoirs and oral histories and documentary films. There is a philosophical dimension to the kamikaze story that haunts it still. The West, broadly speaking, has a cultural tradition that valorizes survival. The hero lives. The hero endures. Death is the defeat, or at least the cost of victory. The kamikaze upended this calculus entirely. It deployed death not as a cost to be avoided, but as a weapon to be aimed. And in doing so, it exposed something genuinely unsettling about the assumptions underlying Western military thought. How do you fight an enemy who does not want to survive? How do you design a defensive system against an attacker who has removed from the equation the one element that all your defensive planning assumes, the attacker's desire to live? These questions were not just tactical puzzles. They were philosophical challenges, and the Americans answered them with technology and firepower and courage and dogged resilience. But they never found a perfect answer. No one ever did, because there is no perfect answer to someone who has decided to die. The legacy of the kamikaze program extends in complicated ways into the modern world. Military planners and analysts have drawn explicit connections between the kamikaze concept and the suicide attacks of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The tactical logic is similar. A determined person who is willing to die, and who is carrying enough explosive material, is extraordinarily difficult to stop, no matter how sophisticated the defensive systems arrayed against him. Kamikaze pilots of 1944 and 1945 were not the first people in history to weaponize death willingly, and they were not the last. Understanding their story, really understanding it, not as a simple tale of fanaticism defeated by American courage and technology, but as a complex human phenomenon rooted in specific cultural and political and psychological conditions, is part of what it means to take history seriously as a way of understanding the present. The Battle for Okinawa ended on June 22, 1945, when the last organized Japanese resistance collapsed. In 82 days of fighting on land and at sea, the campaign had cost the Americans roughly 12,000 dead and more than 36,000 wounded. The Japanese lost over 100,000 soldiers and an unknown number of civilians, trapped on an island that had become a killing ground. And the Kamikaze campaign that had shadowed the entire battle had sunk 36 American ships and damaged hundreds more. When General Simon Bolivar Buckner, the American land commander, was killed by Japanese artillery on June 18, just days before the battle ended, he became the highest-ranking American officer killed in action in the entire Second World War. Okinawa was the battle that was supposed to be the rehearsal for the invasion of Japan. What it actually demonstrated was that the invasion, if it came, would be something almost beyond imagination in its violence and cost. The men who flew the kamikaze missions, taken individually, defy easy categorization. There was Ensign Yukio Seki, the first commander of the Special Attack Corps, who reportedly told a colleague before his final flight that Japan was finished regardless of what the kamikazes accomplished, but that there was simply nothing else to do. There was Lieutenant Yoshinori Yamaguchi, who wrote a farewell poem of heartbreaking beauty and whose diary, discovered after the war, revealed a young man of profound intelligence and equally profound sadness. There was 19-year-old Corporal Yukimasa Tanaka, who had wanted to be a school teacher, who practiced his calligraphy the night before his final mission, who left his brush and inkstone as gifts for the base commander's children. These men were not abstractions, they were not symbols. They were human beings, standing at the intersection of history and ideology and personal courage and fear, making the choices that history demanded of them and paying the ultimate price. The technological arms race that the kamikaze program triggered had implications that extended far beyond the Second World War. The American experience of trying to defend against suicide aircraft pushed the development of faster and more reliable radar systems, more sophisticated fire control computers, better anti-aircraft missiles, and fundamentally new thinking about layered air defense. Many of the concepts that would define Cold War naval doctrine, the idea of defense in depth, the emphasis on electronic warfare and early warning, the development of surface-to-air missiles as the primary defense against air attack, were shaped in significant ways by the experience of fighting kamikazes at Okinawa and Leyte Gulf. The kamikaze threat forced the American military to think in new ways, to abandon comfortable assumptions, to innovate under extreme pressure. And some of what it invented under that pressure would prove to be among the most important military technologies of the second half of the 20th century. There is one final dimension of this story that deserves careful attention, and it is perhaps the most haunting of all. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, there were still thousands of kamikaze pilots waiting for missions that would never come. Some of them had been waiting for months. They had organized themselves mentally and emotionally for death, and now they had to find their way back to life in a Japan that had been defeated, occupied, and was undergoing a transformation so profound that it would have been almost unrecognizable to the men who had sent these young pilots to their deaths. Some of them never fully made that transition. Some of them lived with a complicated grief for the rest of their lives, mourning comrades who had died, wondering what it meant that they had survived, carrying the weight of missions they had been ready to fly but never flew. Some became businessmen, teachers, government officials. Some became fierce advocates for peace, using their own experience as kamikaze pilots to argue for a world in which no young man would ever again be asked to make the choice they had been asked to make. A few became symbols, appearing in documentaries, giving interviews, trying to explain to generations who had not lived through the war what it had been like to be young and Japanese in 1944 and 1945. and to believe that dying was the most important thing you could do. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet, was not given to exaggeration. He was a steady, rational, methodical commander, the kind of man who trusted data and distrusted rhetoric. After the war, when he was asked about the Kamikaze campaign, he said something that has stayed with those who study this history ever since. He said that the courage of the kamikaze pilots was not in doubt. What was in doubt was the wisdom of the men who sent them. That distinction between the courage of the individuals who flew and the responsibility of the system that deployed them cuts to the heart of what the kamikaze story is really about. It is a story about what happens when a nation decides that its ideology is more important than the lives of its young men. It is a story about what happens when military commanders, facing impossible strategic odds, reach for weapons that should never be weapons. It is a story about the relationship between culture and violence, between belief and death, between the stories a society tells about honor and sacrifice and the actual cost of those stories in human lives. And it is a story that the Pacific War forced the American military, the American nation, to confront directly up close. For 10 terrible months in 1944 and 1945, the kamikaze pilots scared the United States Navy more in 1945 than Pearl Harbor had in 1941. And the reason for that is both simple and profound. Pearl Harbor was a shock, a devastating, unexpected blow that killed thousands of Americans and wrecked much of the Pacific Fleet. But Pearl Harbor had an answer. You rebuild, you rearm, you fight back. The kamikaze campaign raised a question that had no clean answer. How do you fight an enemy who has decided that death itself is the weapon? How do you maintain the morale of a fleet under sustained, daily suicide attack for months on end? How do you plan an invasion of a nation that has committed itself to meeting your soldiers and sailors with 10,000 human-guided missiles? The men who grappled with those questions in 1945, who stood their watches on the radar picket line and watched the dots approaching on the screen, who served their guns until the attackers were dead or the ship was on fire, who wrote the planning documents for an invasion that would have been the most costly military operation in American history, those men understood something that history has sometimes softened. The war in the Pacific nearly broke American naval power, not at its beginning, when it was weak and surprised, but near its end, when it was strongest and had already won, and when Japan reached into the darkest corner of human desperation and found a weapon that no amount of steel and radar and courage could completely answer. That is the true legacy of the kamikaze. Not simply the ships sunk or the men killed, though those numbers are real and terrible and deserve to be remembered. The true legacy is the question the kamikazes forced upon the most powerful military force in history. A question about the limits of technology and firepower and rational military planning in the face of human beings who have decided that meaning matters more than survival. The answer the Americans found was imperfect. It was expensive. It was built on the courage and endurance of sailors who stood at their battle stations hour after hour, day after day, knowing what was coming and standing there anyway. It was built on the ingenuity of engineers who worked through the nights to develop better radar and better fuses and better fighter tactics. And ultimately, it was built on the atomic bomb, the weapon that ended the war before the invasion could happen, before the 10,000 waiting kamikazes could fly their final missions, before the question the kamikaze posed could extract its final, perhaps incomprehensible answer. The story of the kamikazes is not a story with heroes and villains, though there are moments of extraordinary heroism and extraordinary evil within it. It is a story about what war does to human beings, what it asks of them, what it takes from them, and what it leaves behind. It is a story about the intersection of culture and violence, ideology and death, duty and despair. It is a story about young men, Japanese and American, who were asked to pay a price that no generation should have to pay, and who paid it anyway because the world they had been born into gave them no other choice. And it is a story that deserves to be told fully, with all its complexity and all its darkness and all its moments of terrible human beauty, because the men who lived it and the men who died in it deserve nothing less. So I ask you this. After everything you have heard today, after all the names and the numbers and the stories, after everything the Kamikaze campaign cost on both sides, in lives and ships and human suffering and moral compromise, here is the question I want to leave you with. If the atomic bombs had not been used, if Operation Downfall had gone forward, if 10,000 kamikazes had risen to meet the invasion fleet off the coast of Kyushu in November 1945, would the world we live in today look different? Would the sacrifices already made have been enough? And what does it tell us about war, about ideology, about the terrible things human beings will do and endure when they believe they have no other choice? Think about that. Leave your answer in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it gave you something that the usual history books leave out, then subscribe. Because there are 1,000 more stories like this one, stories hiding just below the surface of history, stories about ordinary people caught in extraordinary times, and we are going to tell every single one of them.